we left Hannah, did we not, having ascended to Shiloh at the time of their yearly pilgrimage and carrying with her a priestly mantle to place upon her son. And that little coat, so full of significance and meaning, testified, we suggested, to her complete rejection of the priesthood of Hophni and Phinehas. But it was something more than that, because in that little robe of destiny, Hannah was, as it were, calling upon God to provide that new and better priest for the nation. And she was asking him to confirm Samuel as his choice after the spirit of Melchizedek and in the spirit of the Nazirite vow. And the unique garments that that little boy wore and the early promise of his spiritual demeanor, the special character of his Nazirite vow, were all indicators that he was marked out for priesthood. And it must have been on a different basis to that which stood after the Aaronic order. She declared Samuel to be her priest, and she called upon God to endorse that choice from heaven above. And so we take up the record in the 1st of Samuel, chapter 2 and verse 20, when it says, "And Eli blessed Elkanah and his wife." And that's an interesting phrase when you think about it, because although Eli was weak in certain respects, and certainly weak in disciplining his sons, I think he had a very special affinity for the godly young Samuel. And I think also he had a genuine admiration for the spiritual conduct and behavior of Hannah and Elkanah. And we refer to them in that order because even though Eli is going to here address his priestly blessing to Elkanah and his wife, the cause of the blessing relates to Hannah's vision, Hannah's vow, and Hannah's loan. In fact, it says in the verse that Eli used these words when he said, "Yahweh give thee seed of this woman for the loan which is lent to Yahweh." But Green's literal says, "Yahweh shall give you seed of this woman because of the petition which she prayed unto Yahweh." And the Revised Standard Version says, "Yahweh give you children by this woman for the loan which she lent unto Yahweh." So the focus in a very real sense was actually on Hannah and what Hannah had done. In fact, it was an echo of Hannah's own words from chapter 1, verse 26. "I am the woman that stood by thee here praying." And you see, Eli had never forgotten the story of this woman. And the presence of Samuel at the sanctuary every day brought back her story vividly to Eli's mind. The mother of this child was the cause of the spontaneous outpouring on behalf of Eli, by Eli, as he invoked now, in the name of God, that Yahweh himself would bring a fullness of recompense into their lives in return for her supreme gift, the gift of her firstborn son. So here was priestly intercession indeed. And when we read that verse, you get the sense that this was not the only or single act of blessing on Eli's behalf. Because Rotherham's translates it as follows, that Eli used to bless Elkanah and his wife, and so they went their way. So I think the suggestion in the narrative here is that every year as they made their yearly pilgrimage, Eli repeated his priestly blessing before they went home. And year by year, as they returned to Shiloh, they would bring in their train a growing number of children in a continuing cycle of fruitfulness, which showed that the blessing of Eli had indeed rested upon them. Yahweh give thee seed of this woman. I think you see there were overtones of the story of Boaz and Ruth here in Eli's promise and his prophecy. We shan't turn it up, but you'll remember these words. Ruth chapter 4, verses 11 to 15 says these expressions. Yahweh make the woman like Rachel and Leah, the seed which Yahweh shall give thee of this young woman. And Yahweh gave her conception, she that was better than 7 sons, a phrase that Hannah herself has alluded to. And I think all of this is evidence of the profound effect that that little Levite had upon Eli and the impact of Hannah herself upon this old man who loved the truth but who lacked the strength to discipline his offspring. And in this child of God and his mother, Eli saw all that he'd lost in his own sons. And so verse 22 says, and Yahweh visited Hannah so that she conceived. So you notice then that the phrase Eli blessed Elkanah, verse 20, now becomes, and Yahweh visited Hannah, verse 21. Upon Hannah came the divine blessing of favor and visitation, similar not only to Ruth in bearing a special son, but reminiscent also, don't you think, of the intervention of God in the life of Sarah of old. Now again, we shan't look it up, but listen to these expressions from Genesis chapter 21. And Yahweh visited Sarah, for Sarah conceived. And Sarah said, God hath made me to laugh. And Sarah said, who should have said that Sarah should have given children suck? And the child grew the day that Isaac was weaned. And as we read the story of Hannah and Samuel, we hear the echoes, do we not, of Sarah and her special son. All caught in this one phrase from the Spirit in the 1st of Samuel, chapter 2, verse 21, and Yahweh visited Hannah. How much of this do you think Hannah knew and stored in all her heart? I think she knew it all, brothers and sisters. She knew all those stories of the faithful women of old, including Jochebed, who nursed a son before giving him away. And the record says, verse 21, that as a result of that divine visitation, she bare 3 sons and 2 daughters. And in these 5 children, these who would be rightfully hers now to raise back home in Ramah, Hannah received a full measure of the Father's grace upon her. But if we add the child Samuel, as it mentions at the end of the verse, who was still at Shiloh, she had a total of 6 children. Now, you'll remember that she'd alluded to Ruth in her own prayer, 1st of Samuel, chapter 2, verse 5, so that the barren hath borne 7. But Yahweh, in his wisdom, left Hannah short of the 7th, so that she might live in hope. She looked for one who was still to come. So the record says in verse 22, now Eli was very old and heard all that his sons did unto all Israel. And that moment had come, some point when his age prevented him from supervising all of the tabernacle activities personally. But the problem was, you see, that his sons had introduced a corrupt form of worship, but he'd neglected to challenge it. He'd failed to rebuke it. And now his advanced years made it impossible for him to reverse it. He was no longer in charge. These sons of Belial were in control of everything. And so the record says that he heard all that they did unto all. So their spirit affected all matters at the sanctuary. And Hannah too must have known that that old man was absolutely powerless now to stop them. Hannah knew that. In fact, if we want to know how bad it was, the record tells us, verse 22, how they lay with the women that assembled at the door of the tabernacle of the congregation. Now, in the book of the law, brothers and sisters, there's an interesting word, we've come across it already, that describes the service of the Levites. Again, we shan't turn it up, but there's a famous passage in Numbers 4, verse 23, when it says of the Levites, from 30 years old and upward, thou shalt number them, all that enter in to perform the service. But the margin says, to war the warfare. And again, in Numbers 8:24, it says, the Levites shall go in to wait upon the service. But the margin says, to war the warfare. And in both cases, the Hebrew word is the word saba, to fight, to muster, to assemble. It's a military term because it suggests conscription for service. And saba, as we've already discovered, is, well, it's the root word for Yahweh Sabaoth, Yahweh of hosts. And these men, the Levites, in Numbers 4 and Numbers 8, well, they were God's hosts committed to the spiritual warfare of his truth. In fact, I think that idea out of the book of Leviticus, brothers and sisters, is probably the Old Testament basis behind Paul's words to Timothy when he said in the 1st of Timothy chapter 1 and verse 18, "This charge I commit unto thee, son Timothy, that by them thou mightest war a good warfare," says the apostle. And I wonder whether there's a Levitical overtone to what Paul said in charging his son in the faith. But let me tell you something that's interesting about that word Saba. If you come back to the book of Exodus chapter 38, and you'll recall this famous episode at the time of the construction of the tabernacle and the furniture for the tabernacle, that a certain event occurred. We're told of it in Exodus 38 and verse 8. The record says that Moses, well, perhaps not Moses, it's probably actually Bezaleel, the he of this verse. Exodus 38 verse 8, he, Bezaleel, made the laver of brass and the foot of it of brass of the looking glasses of the women assembling, which assembled at the door of the tabernacle of the congregation. Now, do you notice the margin? The margin says assembling by troops. And the margin also says, see the 1st of Samuel, chapter 2, verse 22, and Numbers chapter 4, verse 23, because it's the same word in the Hebrew. It's the word Saba. It's about the assembling of a host. But this time it refers to women. They also came to war, the warfare, as well as the Levites. So of old time, there had been women since the days of Moses who were dedicated to the service of the sanctuary. And if you come to Numbers chapter 31, in the matter of the battle against Midian, we're told that part of the spoils of victory, well, this is what the record says, Numbers 31, and reading firstly verse 26, maybe 25 for connection. It says that Yahweh spake unto Moses, saying, "Take the sum of the prey that was taken both of man and of beast, thou and Eleazar the priest and the chief fathers of the congregation, and divide the prey into 2 parts, between them that took the war upon them, who went out to battle, and between all the congregation." So there was going to be a division of the spoils of what they had gathered in warfare here. But you notice what verse 35 goes on to say, that in terms of the spoils, verse 35, there were 32,000 persons in all of women that had not known man by lying with him. And of those women, we're told in verse 40, the persons were 16,000, of which Yahweh's tribute was 32 persons. And Moses gave that tribute, which was Yahweh's heave offering, unto Eleazar the priest, as Moses commanded, as Yahweh commanded Moses. So 32 virgins were given to Eleazar the priest. But verse 47 goes on to say, "And even of the children of Israel's half, Moses took one portion of 50, both of man and of beast, and gave them unto the Levites, which kept the charge of the tabernacle of Yahweh, as Yahweh commanded Moses." So 32 virgins were given to Eleazar the priest, verse 41, and 320 virgins were given to the Levites in verse 47. So there were virgins sent for service at the sanctuary that came under the authority of both the high priest and the Levites. And these virgins, incidentally, were from another nation, from Midian. But they served at the sanctuary in the spirit of devotion and in complete commitment to Yahweh's cause. In fact, I wonder whether the story of those virgins was part of the basis for the Apostle Paul's advice concerning virgins that he gives in the 1st of Corinthians chapter 7. Just listen to his words and see if you can capture a sense of the virgins of the Old Testament sanctuary. Because Paul says this, 1 Corinthians 7, verses 34 and 35, "There is a difference also," he says, "between a wife and a virgin. The unmarried woman careth for the things of the Lord, that she may be holy both in body and spirit. But she that's married careth for the things of the world, how she may please her husband. And this I speak for your own profit, for that which is comely, and that ye may attend upon the Lord without distraction. And I think that was the spirit of those virgins of Old Testament times. They were there to attend upon the Lord without distraction. And those women of the sanctuary are alluded to at the time of the temple's destruction, many centuries after Hannah's time. Because Lamentations chapter 1 verse 4 says, the ways of Zion do mourn, because none come to the solemn feasts. All her gates are desolate, her priests sigh, her virgins are afflicted, and she is in bitterness. So these then, coming back to the 1st of Samuel, chapter 2, these women were the honoured and honourable women whose lives were devoted to spiritual things. Because in verse 22 of the 1st of Samuel chapter 2, when it speaks of the woman that assembled at the door, that's the same phrase found in Exodus chapter 38, as the margin says, they were the Sabers. They assembled as Yahweh's hosts at the door. These were lives devoted to spiritual things, whether in fasting or praying or singing, whether in making or cleansing or preparing. They served at the sanctuary. And it was these women that Hophni and Phinehas committed immorality with. So either they were so far removed from the spirit of those who gave their mirrors to Moses in rejecting the vanity of outward appearance, or, as will be more likely, the priests, on whose approval the food and the clothing and the accommodation and the livelihoods of these women depended, had simply said that more was expected of them if they wanted to stay in Shiloh. Corruption of doctrine, verses 13 to 17, is inevitably followed by corruption in practice, verse 22. And these women had probably been placed in a difficult, if not impossible, situation. So this is what Eli says, verse 23. He said unto them, why do ye do such things? For I hear of your evil dealings by all this people. And so Eli did remonstrate with his sons, but his words lacked power, didn't they? Because he was too meek, he was too mild, and because they knew already, as did he, that his words would never be backed by any action. And so the result was that their wickedness was so notorious as to be evidenced by widespread and general complaint. I hear, says Eli, by all. Everyone knew about it. It was no secret. The whole of Israel knew what was going on at the sanctuary. And Eli must have been ashamed and embarrassed by what his sons were like and how his sons behaved. In fact, he said to them, verse 24, nay, my sons, it is no good report that I hear. You make Yahweh's people to transgress. And so the life lived by these priests publicly in the sanctuary with their scornful unbelief of the holy ordinances and their unblushing immorality corrupted the inner religious life of the nation. The Septuagint says at the end of that verse, ye make Yahweh's people cease to worship him. Ah, there's the rub. Cease to worship him. You see, this was the source of Hannah's grief. This was why she hated their spirit. She was devastated by the shocking impact of Hophni and Phinehas on the nation's worship. That's why she grieved. That's why she couldn't eat. That's why she prayed for a son. That's why she gave praise when she loaned him. That's why she brought the little coat. That's why she was on a collision course with these two. And the battle was now fairly joined because that little boy is at Shiloh. So Eli said to his boys, verse 25, if one man sin against another, the judge shall judge him. But if a man sin against Yahweh, who shall entreat for him? So you see, what he was really saying, I think, is that a sin by one person against another person was dealt with by recourse to the judge. The controversy between this man and that man was taken to the judge for reconciliation. But if a man sin against God, says Eli, who shall intercede for him? And the answer is, well, they needed a priest. But Hophni and Phinehas had sinned grievously against God themselves. Who could they go to for intercession? They were the priests. And Eli pleaded with them to realize the terrible predicament that they had placed themselves in because they had put themselves beyond the scope of intercession or forgiveness. And Hannah wanted what they couldn't provide. She looked for a priest who could plead for the nation and who could do so as a righteous intercessor, but it would never happen under these men. And that's why she had done everything in this story, and heaven agreed with her. In fact, you see what the record says at the end of the verse? Notwithstanding, they hearkened not unto the voice of their father. So their father's reproof made no impression upon them because they were already given up to the judgment of hardening. Hophni and Phinehas sealed their own fate by their refusal to take warning. Now, here's a little cascade of interesting references pertinent to the sense, I think, of this particular verse. These are all references that say that at various stages in people's lives, God was at work to bring about his cause, his purpose, his objectives, despite what they were doing or thinking. That he was in sovereign control to move forward with his own purpose. Joshua chapter 11, verse 20. Judges chapter 14, verse 4. 1 of Kings chapter 12, verse 15. 2 of Chronicles chapter 25 and verse 20. These are all examples of moments or episodes where Yahweh was at work behind the scenes to bring about his irresistible purpose, which could not be stopped. And that's exactly the position that Hophni and Phinehas were in right now. You see, they were unaware, completely unaware, that Yahweh's hand was already moving against them. Do you see what it says at the end of the verse? Notwithstanding, they hearkened not unto the voice of their father, because, says the record, because Yahweh would slay them. But the Hebrew's much stronger than that. Because the literal Hebrew is because Yahweh was pleased to slay them. Green's literal says because Yahweh desired to execute them. Young's literal says Yahweh hath delighted to put them to death. You almost couldn't believe that such a statement could be made, could you, brothers and sisters, about anyone? So the impending death of Hophni and Phinehas was already in motion, and God now needed to make provision, the provision that Hannah sought for, in raising up another priest in their place. Well, he was already doing so, brothers and sisters. And isn't it remarkable that the record writes itself up in such a way, under the influence of the Spirit of God, that after all that evil so described in these verses, that the good of Samuel is now impressed upon us, even in his childhood. Because this is what verse 26 goes on to say. It says, and the child Samuel grew and was in favour both with Yahweh and also with men. Do you know, normally those two categories exclude each other. Trying to be in favour with both God and men is not altogether easy. But in Samuel's case, even as a boy, there was an exhibition of dedication so serious, so wholesome, so earnest, that everyone looking on the lad could not but help to approve of his godly ways. Now, here's the paradox. You see, the priests in this place were evil to the core. The honour of their sacrifices was corrupted. The worship of the sanctuary was defiled. In fact, hold your hand in Samuel, but just come for a moment to the 78th Psalm, because, again, some of you will know that there's a direct reference to this precise moment of time in the history of the nation, we believe, in the 78th Psalm, but it tells us just how bad the state of the nation was at the time little Samuel arrived at the sanctuary. Because this is what it says in the 78th Psalm, and reading verses 60 to 64, because this calamity was just about to fall upon them. Verse 60 of Psalm 78 says, "So that he, God, forsook the tabernacle of Shiloh, the tent which he'd placed among men, and delivered his strength into captivity, and his glory, the ark of his holiness, into the enemy's hand. He gave his people over also unto the sword. He was wroth with his inheritance. The fire consumed their young men. Their maidens were not given to marriage. Their priests fell by the sword, and their widows made no lamentation." You see, this was the state of spiritual calamity that hung over the nation when little Samuel arrived at the sanctuary. And yet the strange thing is that the child walked through the midst of all that in Shiloh and somehow seemed to live a charmed life. No evil touched him and no harm reached him. So the question is, how did that happen? Well, the obvious answer is, well, Yahweh's providential care kept him safe. True. But what instrument did God use? What instrument did God providentially employ to keep the child safe? Well, it's clear that Samuel must have been under the chaperonage of a guardian. And given the tremendous responsibility that lay upon that person, we can be equally sure that providence overshadowed their selection and their placement. And when we ponder the needs of that little child in the 1st of Samuel, chapter 2 and verse 26, we recognize the qualities that his guardian must have possessed. And on that basis, the possibilities as to who that person might have been are greatly narrowed. So think about it, brothers and sisters. Samuel was so very young when he arrived at the temple that it is logical to assume that a woman must have taken care of him. Eli is too old and too infirm to be able to personally minister to the needs of such a little child. A woman was essential, but not any woman might do. In the first instance, she needed to be resident at the sanctuary. Only someone who was permanently in attendance could offer the continuing attention necessary for a young child every single day. He was still a little child, and he needed help to eat and to drink, to sleep and to rise, to wash and to dress, to speak and to read, to sing and to pray, to learn and to grow. He needed all of that, did he not? Every day, he needed the security of her voice, and he needed the warmth of her touch, and he needed the care of her love, and he needed the sense of her presence. She had to be constantly there in his life. And as the child grew, her role might change, but she would always need to be visible and accessible to him. So, a woman who lived at the temple. But this woman would be responsible for much more than simply the feeding and clothing of the child. His spiritual and his social and his mental development were also important for the role he was destined to fulfill. And someone was needed to watch over those with godly care. The households of Hophni and Phinehas were utterly unsuitable for this little boy to be raised in. Homes dominated by such evil men would never have provided the godly haven that Samuel needed for the spiritual nurture of his early years. In fact, this woman needed to share the faith of Hannah herself, a kindred spirit in her fervent love for the truth, like-minded concerning the destiny of the child, because she would need to be to the little Levite in Shiloh what Hannah would have been for him in Ramah. This woman would be the child's mother in the absence of the mother herself. So not just a woman who was permanently at the temple, but a woman who shared Hannah's spirit. And I think there was one third vital quality required in this woman who might overshadow Samuel's life. She needed to have a personal standing and a moral authority that was beyond reproach and beyond rebuke. A woman whose personal influence was so strong that she could provide the blessing of the supervision the boy needed. How else do you think that the evil of Hophni and Phinehas would be kept at bay other than by one whose example could quell even their wickedness? Such a woman would be rare indeed. But only one of such high reputation would be the ideal of guardian care that the boy needed. So a woman who commanded respect. And in the providence of God, there was someone who met all three requirements. A woman who was resident at the sanctuary, a woman who shared Hannah's fervent spirit, and a woman whose reputation was formidable enough to silence even Eli's sons. A woman whose own dedication to the truth was undoubted and whose commitment to the spirit of vows and their performance was unquestioned. A woman whose example was celebrated and revered by the daughters of Israel. And that woman, we suggest, was Jephthah's daughter, who was already at the sanctuary long before Samuel was born. Now, I know, brothers and sisters, that there are divergent views on the matter of Jephthah's vow. But I'm going to suggest to you that the scriptural evidence supports the view that he devoted his daughter to perpetual service at the sanctuary and not to the idea that he slew her as a human sacrifice. But for all of that, the cost of his vow was very real. Now come back and have a look at it because, well, we're going to see some connections here. In the book of Judges in chapter 11, let's just take up the record firstly of what he did do and then see how this might tie back to the story of Hannah and Samuel. In the book of Judges, chapter 11, verse 29, and of course, because of time, we're not going to be able to investigate the whole matter in detail this morning. We're just going to touch across the surface to pick up some things that are helpful to the story of Hannah. So you see what it says in Judges 11, verse 29, then says, then the Spirit of Yahweh came upon Jephthah. Now that's important to see because when it says now in verse 30, and Jephthah vowed a vow unto Yahweh and said, this is a man who's already under the influence and under the control of the Spirit of God at the time he makes his vow. So it's reasonable for us to assume that a man under such guidance of the Spirit and who's already showed his spiritual and scriptural abilities in this chapter has made a sensible vow and a proper vow and not a foolish one. And so what the vow was this. Verse 30, if thou shalt without fail deliver the children of Ammon into mine hands, then it shall be that whatsoever cometh forth of the doors of my house to meet me, when I return in peace from the children of Ammon, shall surely be Yahweh's, and I will offer it up for a burnt offering. Now, you see that word whatsoever? That word, asher, in the phrase, whatsoever cometh forth out of the doors of my house, that word is better rendered whosoever. It's rendered that way by Rotherham's in the Revised Standard Version. Whoever cometh forth out of the doors of my house. In fact, there's only one other place we believe in the scriptural record where that exact expression in the Hebrew is found. Asher yisi midalti, and it's rendered in one place only here, Joshua chapter 2 verse 19, when it says there, and it shall be that whosoever shall go out of the doors of thy house. It's an almost identical expression to that of Judges chapter 11 and verse 31 here. Now, why that's important, brothers and sisters, is because what that word tells us is that Jephthah planned, I believe, on dedicating or devoting a person from the outset. He never intended to offer an animal, but he did intend to dedicate a person, whosoever comes forth. And associated with that dedication would be a matching sacrifice. So the person belonged to God. They shall surely be Yahweh's. And the burnt offering that accompanied that dedication, I will offer up a burnt offering, was the symbol of it. Now, when it says in verse 31, at the end of the verse, and I will offer it up for a burnt offering, you may know that the word for is not there in the Hebrew text. There is no word for. In fact, the entire Hebrew expression, and I will offer it up for a burnt offering, is only two Hebrew words. And those two Hebrew words are wahaletu, olah. And those two Hebrew words essentially mean, I will offer him, that is God, a burnt offering. You see, it would require what's described as a prepositional prefix to represent the word for, but it's not there. It's not there in the text at all. In fact, the Treasury of Scriptural Knowledge says of that phrase that wahaletu olah means I will offer him or to him, that is Yahweh, a burnt offering. For Hu may with much more propriety be referred to the person to whom the sacrifice was to be made than to the thing to be sacrificed. Now, before we continue then, let me just give you a word concerning the law of vows, concerning devoted things, because this in part is what this matter relates to. The Theological Word Book of the Old Testament says about the matters devoted to God, it's referred to in Leviticus 27, the Hebrew word cherem. It says it means this. The basic meaning of cherem is the exclusion of an object from the use of man and its irrevocable surrender to God. Surrendering something to God meant devoting it to the service of God or putting it under a ban for destruction. So how would you decide whether a devoted thing was to be devoted in service or devoted to destruction? Well, the context obviously applied, and it was important to distinguish between those devoted cherem of men from the nations and those devoted cherem to Yahweh out of Israel. In both instances, their lives belonged to God without recall, but their destinies were completely different. You see, those devoted out of the nations were given to destruction, and their lives were forfeit in death. And Joshua 6, verses 17 to 21 is an illustration of such a cherem. But there was no basis ever for anyone in Israel to devote another Israelite to death. That was murder. And it was a breach of the sixth commandment, thou shalt not kill. And we are expressly told that those devoted to Yahweh out of Israel were given as a gift to the high priest, and their lives were forfeit in service, but not in death. Numbers chapter 18, verse 14. And this is the vow that we believe that Jephthah made on this occasion. And so what we're really being told here in Judges 11 and verse 31 is that in addition to devoting his daughter without the right of redemption, he also offered a corresponding burnt offering to symbolize her complete dedication. She was to be utterly in the state of lifetime service. Now, you notice how his daughter responded. Verse 36. Jephthah's daughter said unto him, verse 36, she said, My father, if thou hast opened thy mouth unto Yahweh to do to me according to that which hath proceeded out of thy mouth, well, then you must do so, forasmuch as Yahweh has taken vengeance of thee for thine enemies. So the daughter actually referred to the law of vows. She refers back to the very chapter in Numbers 30 that Hannah and Hilkiah had discussed in making their own vow concerning the dedication of a child to perpetual service, and she urged her father to fulfill his vow. She only asked for one thing, and here's the one thing she asked for, verse 37. She said unto her father, Let this thing be done unto me. Let me alone 2 months, that I may go up and down upon the mountains and bewail my virginity, I and my fellows. And he said, Go. And he sent her away for 2 months, and she went with her companions and bewailed her virginity upon the mountains. Now, just stop and think about what's being mentioned here. Do you notice that she bewailed her virginity, not her impending death? Why did she bewail her virginity? Well, because the whole principle of the burnt offering was dedication in perpetuity. And if Jephthah fulfilled his vow, she will be dedicated for the whole of her life to God at the sanctuary. And that included the part of her life that might have been offered to a husband or to a family. She didn't mourn because she had to die as a virgin. She mourned because she had to live as a virgin. And her virginity stood in some special relationship to the nature of her vow, which was that she would be given utterly to Yahweh's service as a virgin at the sanctuary. And so verse 39 says, it came to pass at the end of 2 months that she returned unto her father, who did with her according to his vow, which he had vowed, and she knew no man. Now, if all he had done was just kill her, then adding the phrase, she knew no man, adds nothing to the circumstance of her death, because we already know she's a virgin. But having been dedicated for perpetual service, the phrase, she knew no man, tells us how her vow was fulfilled, in what context and in what dimension her vow was outworked. She served at the sanctuary, and as a result, she knew no man in fulfillment of her vow because she served as a virgin. And as we've already seen, the practice of having virgins in service at the temple had been in operation since the days of Moses. Certainly right through to Hannah's own time. So verse 40 says, and it was a custom, taking the last words of verse 39, it was a custom in Israel that the daughters of Israel went yearly to lament the daughter of Jephthah the Gileadite 4 days in a year. It says they went yearly. But do you notice the margin? The margin says they went from year to year. Now, where have we heard that phrase before, brothers and sisters? From year to year? That's the very expression used in the 1 of Samuel chapter 1 verse 3 about Hannah and Elkanah. This man and his family went out of his city from year to year to worship and to sacrifice in Shiloh. And in the margin of the 1 of Samuel chapter 1 verse 3, it says, see Judges 11 verse 40. So the daughters of Israel went from year to Shiloh, because that's where Jephthah's daughter was. And what did they go for? Well, it says they went to lament. Now, that word lament, tanah, the margin says it means to talk with. Now, you can't talk with a dead person, but you could talk with a woman who was living at the sanctuary if you visited her there, which is why they went year by year to that place. In fact, that word, to lament, is only found on one other occasion in the whole of the Scriptures, and it's right here in the book of Judges. Again, we shan't turn it up, but it's in the margin. It's Judges chapter 5, verse 11. So it's a pretty unique word, and it's translated this way in Judges 5:11. Those that are delivered from the noise of the archers in the places of drawing water, there shall they rehearse the righteous acts of Yahweh. They shall rehearse them. And the use of that same word tells us firstly that it relates to words and speech and conversation. And it also tells us that the tone of those words was positive, not negative. They didn't go to lament. They went to celebrate. Strong says that the word means it's a primary root through the idea of attributing honor. You see, this woman was famous in Israel, absolutely famous. Now, here's the question. Where do you think the story of Hannah comes in relation to Jephthah's daughter? Well, the answer is much closer in time than we might have imagined. Because Jephthah was one of 4 judges who judged in the northeast of Israel, Jephthah, Ibzan, Elon, Abdon, and they all appear in the book of Judges immediately before the 40 years of Philistine oppression. But that time when they judged was contemporary with the first 20 years of Eli's work as a judge in the southwest, which also came before the Philistine oppression. So by the time Hannah grew to womanhood and had Samuel in the second 20 years of Eli's epoch, because he was a judge for 40 years, the virgin daughter of Jephthah had been at the sanctuary for quite some time. But the closeness of these 2 episodes answers a puzzle in the divine record. And that puzzle is this, brothers and sisters. Do you realize that we've got twin stories of the dedication of a child to perpetual service at the sanctuary? Now just watch my hands and see the connection. In Judges 11 verse 30, Jephthah vowed a vow of faithfulness. In the 1st of Samuel chapter 1 verse 11, Hannah vowed a vow of faithfulness. In Judges 11 verse 31, Jephthah promised to dedicate a person to Yahweh. In the 1st of Samuel chapter 1 verse 11, Hannah promised to dedicate a person to Yahweh. In Judges 11:35, Jephthah's vow which proceeded out of his mouth was upheld. In the 1st of Samuel chapter 1 verse 23, Hannah's vow which proceeded out of her mouth was upheld. In Judges 11 verse 39, Jephthah's only child, his daughter, was pledged to perpetual service at the sanctuary. In the 1st of Samuel chapter 1 verse 28, Hannah's only child, her son, was pledged to perpetual service at the sanctuary. In Judges 11 verse 31, the dedication of Jephthah's daughter was accompanied by a whole burnt offering. In the 1st of Samuel chapter 1 verse 24, the dedication of Hannah's son was accompanied by a whole burnt offering. Now, would you imagine that those 2 accounts so close together in time are coincidental? I think not. The uniqueness of these twin episodes found in such proximity in both scripture and time, but nowhere else, argues that the one was in fact the basis for the other. And we know which one came first. And that fact suggests that the 2 stories are an exact counterpart of each other because the one is a conscious imitation of the other. And Hannah didn't come to slay her son. She came to dedicate him on the basis of the example that she was following. See, I think that Jephthah's vow not only inspired Hannah, but the presence of his daughter at the sanctuary gave Hannah the confidence she needed to dedicate her son in that place. Because we know that Hannah was one of those faithful women who did visit the sanctuary every year, 1st of Samuel chapter 1 verse 3, and in the providence of God, she'd met this woman. She'd met this virgin daughter of a faithful judge. The whole story of Samuel's dedication rings with the tones of the dedication of Jephthah's daughter, and her fervency and her faithfulness were the keys that provided Hannah with the hope that it could be done. She was the catalyst that stirred Hannah into her own dramatic and decisive action. And now think about how perfect a solution this was to a conundrum. You see, Jephthah's daughter commanded such fame and respect in the land, Judges 11 verse 40, that even Hophni and Phinehas would have been very reluctant to challenge her. Her reputation for godliness was so well known that she'd be the one person at the temple they dare not oppose or confront, a woman whose sanctity was beyond compromise, a living legend who would be an ideal protector for the child. She could wrap him in a robe of privacy and conceal the worst excesses of that place from his young eyes and his innocent mind. And under her watchful eye, she could nurture the boys if she was his guardian angel. So come back to the 1st of Samuel, chapter 2. And let's just take up that record then as we come to a close of our thoughts. In the 1st of Samuel, chapter 2, let's just read that 26th verse again. Because when it says, you see, the child Samuel grew on and was in favor both with Yahweh and also with men, we realize that the father had already planned for this moment long before in the circumstances of life. So behind the scenes, when it says the child Samuel grew in favor, that was not an accident. God, in his providential wisdom, arranged for the right woman to be in the right place at the right time, to be a mother to the little boy. And before Hannah besought Yahweh of hosts for a man-child, Jephthah's daughter had already been dedicated at the sanctuary. She had no idea when submitting willingly to her father's vow what the consequences of her faithfulness would be. But God did. And he was even then preparing for the next stage of his purpose, which she, Jephthah's daughter, knew nothing about. You see, there's always such amazing wisdom and economy in God's arrangements, because here, in one moment of time, Yahweh brought the needs of 3 people into focus. And in one action, so glorious in its simplicity, Samuel was protected. Hannah was comforted, and Jephthah's daughter was fulfilled. She had a child to love. She had a child to look after. She had a child to guard. Never ever could she have dreamed of such a possibility at the time she bewailed her virginity. And this woman, whose own prospect of marriage and children was removed, was now privileged to nurse a child, and not just any child, but the one set for the deliverance of his people. There could not have been a more wonderful outcome to her life. And her presence in Shiloh was the perfect answer to the needs of the mother and the child whose lives would intersect hers at the temple. And now, don't you think? Now we know how Hannah was able to leave her son there and walk away, because he was left in the care of a woman who shared her spirit and who believed in the destiny of her son. And right from his first moment in Shiloh, there were signs of a woman's touch and of a woman's care. We're told that Samuel ministered before Yahweh being a child and, do you remember, girded with a linen ephod. I don't think there were any size 3 ephods hanging in the temple wardrobe. Someone made that little garment and put it on the boy because she believed in his destiny just as strongly as the boy's mother did. And Hannah must have been overwhelmed at the thought that what she had construed as delay, the father regarded as timing. And having met this faithful woman, Hannah saw in her the divine answer as to how God would care for the child that she'd loaned to him. She'd always believed implicitly that God could and that he would. But to know how he would do it, well, that was a mother's special need. She needed to know. And God, who knew the end from the beginning, had already prepared the way before Hannah had even made her request. If she fulfilled her vow and gave her child to him, he had already made preparations to receive him. You see, everything in God's arrangements are planned with extraordinary precision. They're calibrated according to a calendar that only God could imagine and that only God can control. And as we come to the table of the Lord this day, we see that same principle at work in the life of our Lord. Do you know that Christ was fully aware of this in his own time? He knew that his entire ministry was counted down against the clock of God, and that every moment was marked on the calendar of the divine plan. It says in Galatians chapter 4 and verse 4, "But when the fullness of time was come, God sent forth his Son, made of a woman." It says in Romans 5 verse 6, for when we were yet without strength, in due time, the margin says, according to the time. The New American Standard Bible says, at the right time, Christ died for the ungodly. And there was no exaggeration here, was there? Christ was born at exactly the right moment, as foretold in the prophecy of the 70 weeks. And Christ died at exactly the right moment on the right day of the right year for the calendar to perfectly align his death and his resurrection in accordance with prophecy. And the Lord knew that right down to the very hour of his death, how it would all be. My time is at hand. The hour is come, he said. How thankful we should be as we come to the table this day to know that everything in God's plan of redemption in his Son was outworked in the precision of God's timetable. And if that was true of Hannah and of our Lord, then it's true as well that our lives are subject to this principle. Our prayers to the Father, and what we might imagine as the postponement of his response, is simply the adjustment of our timetable to his until the circumstances are right. And if his answer is in the affirmative, then with it we may have confidence that the means will be at hand. God operates on his timetable and not ours, and we've got to learn to trust that. But when the time is right, in his purpose, things will happen. And Hannah knew that now. Hannah absolutely knew all of this now. So were all of her wishes fulfilled? This woman whose mind was always focused on higher things, this sister who saw beyond the present and who hoped for so much in this controversy with the sons of Eli, what did happen to them, these sons of Belial, after her song predicted their downfall and destruction? And did the little boy grow into the one she hoped for? The priest whose prayers would ascend to heaven and be heard? And would it bring about the transformation in the nation that she'd sought for in all her petitions? Well, those questions, brothers and sisters, will form the basis for our final study.